Hello and welcome to the video for Don't Give a Wank Wednesday, October 7th, 2015. Our small project today will be on hiding or unhiding objects based on the visibility to the player. Basically, if you've played Arkham Knight, there's a scene where you are playing as the Joker, and in an attempt to tell a story, you are guided through a set of set pieces, one by one, but instead of you just walking down a narrow corridor, the environment changes around you depending on what you're looking at or not looking at, and it creates an eerie feeling. It's also a good way maybe if you want to have jump scares. Some other people have shown me some other games that also recreate this effect, and I just thought I would try to do it on the cheap and easy and see what we can do. So let me go ahead and play our example. I'll walk through it a little bit and let you know what is happening, and then we'll discuss it in further detail. And we can ignore that giant explosion. Let's mute the sound. Okay, so basically I went with an unlit, completely dark environment because shadows sucked, and I kept having to worry about shadows showing up or hiding or not looking right as I was hiding and unhiding meshes, and instead we now have this nice neon unlit look that works for us. So if we proceed forward, we have a text, and that's basically it. Now if we look around the rest of the room, it's completely closed. If we go over to the back end, there's another pop-up just to maybe progress the story. If we turn back around, we'll notice that blue wall is gone, and we now have a green wall that's further down. As we get closer, we get another pop-up. Now if we were to turn around, there's nothing behind us, and then now we turned around again and that green wall is gone again. Okay, so we continue on. We see a little note that says quick this way. We head over there. We actually find, based on the lighting scheme, it's part of the level and you can't go out. You're stuck. Well, if we go back, there's a little message over here. Who is out there? There's another one, knock knock. We go over here, it disappears. We look back around the room. That one disappeared. Oh, now there's a room. Now there's a door. We go over the door, it says come in. We can go in and out, and it tells us. If we go into the door, there's a little message. We get closer, it says don't look back. Up, we turn around and the door is closed behind us. Let me go ahead and stop that and do another run through and show you how some of the things are slightly different. And I'm going to speed through this one. Now for this trigger volume right here, it triggers once we've looked at it and then didn't look at it. If we were to back through, for example, you'll notice it will not close. That's because it has been set up to not close if we are looking at it. If we are not looking at it, it will close behind us, and boom, there you go, you're trapped in. The other door, well, blocking here, this one, if we are to walk, we've already seen where if we walked past it, it'll close behind us. Now if we were to walk backwards, it will not close behind us. It's not set to close behind us until we've done that, and then boom. I've gone ahead and made a few blueprints. We'll go over the blueprints and we'll discuss what I did, and we'll go from there. So to make things nice and simple and easy, what I thought I would do is simply take our character, and I kind of cheat, and what I do is, this is the default first-person character. I'm using the default first-person template. All of this code will be available on the website linked below, where all of the Don't Give a Wank Wednesday projects are stored. So let me go ahead and switch this over to debug, and we will go ahead and show you exactly what's happening. So I'll go ahead and play it, and now you notice the little red dot. All I'm doing is line tracing forward and line tracing backwards, which you can't really see because it's behind me, but I'm just simply line tracing forward and behind the player every frame, and then based on what it hits, if it's the correct thing, it does something. Okay, so let's walk through the code. So we have our event tick. Basically I do a forward trace. I threw this in a function just simply to clean up the code a little bit. All we're doing here is taking the camera, getting its location, that's where we start, taking the camera, getting the world's rotation on the camera, getting the forward vector, which is a 1 value basically, and normalized I think is what it is, multiplying it by 1,000 so that way we're 1,000 units ahead in the forward vector from the camera, using that for our end, and then piping it back out to a return node. I do the same thing on the not forward trace. I simply call it not forward instead of backwards. That way, you know, it works more like a bool where it is or it is not. And the backwards one is a negative 2,000 in the direction, which would of course be 2,000 units backwards. So we pipe it out and we check, did we hit anything? If we didn't hit anything, then there's no reason to do anything else. So we actually go and we do our not forward trace and do the same thing. If we didn't hit anything, we end there. We wasted 2 line traces and 2 if branches, and line traces themselves are very efficient, so it's not even an issue. You could have done this a different way. That's the great part about coding. You could make it where the event tick pulls into a sequence node, and then the sequence node does our forward trace and for sequence 1, and then does the backwards not forward trace for sequence 2. Same effect, just 2 different ways of doing it. I kind of like the way this came out in a nice long pattern. So anyways, we check to see if we hit something. If we did, I'm cheating. Basically, I figured I'll use blueprint interfaces, and all of my items that I care about colliding with implement the blueprint interface on if it triggers forwards player facing or player not facing. So we check to see, does this item that we hit implement the trigger player facing interface? If it does, we continue on. If not, we go ahead and fire our next trace. Next thing, well, unfortunately, you cannot change interfaces at runtime as far as I can tell, and we don't want this to continue running over and over and over. For example, if we were to not do our next part, every single time it did a hit and it implemented it, it would just continue on and keep pinging and sending messages over and over. So what I do next is I see if it actually has a tag. You can change tags at runtime, which is awesome. So I see, does this actor have the tag trigger facing? If so, then we go on. If not, well, we fire a backwards trace. If it does, I fire off a interface message for player facing us triggered with the target of what we hit. And we know it's going to have that because it implements the interface. I do the exact same thing for the backwards trace, except I make sure it's a trigger not facing for the tag, and it's implementing the not facing blueprint interface. So it's a nice and simple way of basically firing off only one message anytime we hit something that we want to hit, and making sure we only do it once. Now, to make sure we only do it once, that's where our events actually come in inside of our items. I have made 2 different items. One's a removable wall, one's a replaceable wall. The removable wall is pretty simple, as you can see here. Here are our 2 events that are triggered whenever the line cast, line trace, line cast. Are we using Unity or Unreal here? Let's see, line trace. So whenever the line trace is triggered, let's go with this one. Facing us triggered, it fires off and hits this. All we're doing is very simple. We're setting our trigger tag, which before was trigger facing. Now we're setting it to trigger not facing. This allows us to hit it when we're facing it, tell the object, okay, we've hit you, do what you want. And then in this code, for example, maybe I wanted to change the color or put a message or make it flash, whatever your event, you can go right here. For this one, all I'm doing is removing the wall when you're not looking at it. So all I'm doing is using that event to identify that I now want to trigger another event when you're not facing it. So by setting our trigger not facing as our tag, we are now waiting to be hit by a line trace when we are not facing it. And also, now that we have this as the only tag, we will no longer call this event because we are no longer waiting for a trigger facing. So let's say we go ahead, we hit it, boom, we flip the trigger. We flip the tag, now we are waiting for trigger not facing. When the player turns around, the backwards line trace fires off, it checks, it sees that it implements the interface. We go to our class settings, yep, this one implements not facing. That's why we have this event right here. It checks the tag. Well, we've already faced it. We've set the trigger to now be not facing. and it fires it off. Once it goes in here, all we're doing is clearing out our tags. Just if you were to have more code in here, that's a smart thing to do, so that way you'll never trigger it again. It fires off whatever event you want. All I'm doing in this case is destroying it, and that's it. You're done. So our first one is one of those removable walls. Right now we've hit the first trigger event. So right now, if I was to, here, let's go in here and let's print a string. And we'll go ahead and print a string here, and we will call this player facing triggered. I probably should leave my debug code in here for at least demonstration purposes, I'm noticing. And we'll go ahead and play this. We watch the top left corner as we get closer to our blue wall, player facing triggered. Now you notice it only does that once. Well, if we were to go in here and we were not to set this, let's say we unhooked this and we just jumped right over. We ran this again. Now watch our messages. Yup, we are continually hit. The red walls have no interface, so we're fine, but once we hit that blue wall, boom, it's continually calling every frame that messaging event. And that's not what we want. That is why we have our nice little trigger event here. Once we change our tag, we no longer worry about calling this, and it only calls it once. So keep that in mind for why we're using these tags. So down here, we destroy the actor, and that's it. So we play, we walk, we trigger, nothing's happening. It's only called that once. We turn around, now we hit the blue wall with our back trigger. It has now destroyed it, even though we can't see it. We turn back around, and it's gone. Simple as that. This is a simple one where all I wanted to do was destroy it. But the next thing is, for example, as we walk through the blue one, and we destroy it, we go to our green one, and we destroy it, you'll notice the green one actually comes back, and now it's red, and it's blocking us in this area. Well, that is what my replaceable wall is for. So let's go ahead and go into our replaceable wall. You will find most of the code is the same in here with a few small changes. Oh, and I forgot to cover this part. I apologize. Our event begin play event. This one's pretty simple. All we're doing is making sure that when we fire, that this object has the trigger set to its array as trigger facing, so we will automatically fire when a line cast, let's go with line trace, hits it. And then we're creating a dynamic material instance, because if you're going to set your material in runtime, you need a dynamic material instance. And then we are setting that material based on our user setting. If we go into our blueprint or our level and we go to our first wall, where are we at? Here we go. Here's our first wall right here. You'll notice it has a field for material for mesh. This allows me to change in design time what color I want this mesh to be. So for example, it's gray in here, but when we run it, it's blue. And I can change that to whatever I want. And that's actually useful for our next one, which is our replaceable, because you actually see two different meshes. You'll have a changed material once it's actually fired off, and then a plain material for when it's not been triggered. That allows me to basically have the wall that's green, but when we replace it, the wall is red, so it actually looks like it was a continuous normal wall out of nowhere. So let's go back to our code now that we've finished that. Begin play event. It's identical in the other one. We make our array, we set this up to accept a trigger facing event, and then we create our dynamic material instances and set it. So our next events, we've got 4 more. Let's go ahead and go over our trigger events. Okay, so here's our trigger events. I've gone ahead and added a few extra variables in here to allow us options on the walls, and we will cover those as we go through them. So basically, since this is a respawnable wall, we need to keep track of, is it hidden or is it visible? So the first thing we do if we're facing this wall, this object, is check to see if we've already hidden it. If we have hidden it already, then we do this branch. We're going to ignore this for now, and we're going to assume that we haven't hidden it yet. We're going to assume that it's the first time we've seen this wall. So we do the same thing we do on the other wall, and we tell the wall, okay, well, now that you've seen it, let's go ahead and set it up where we'll trigger when we're behind the player. So that's this one down here, and we do the same thing. We clear it out, so that way we're no longer accepting any more triggers. We don't want any more line traces. We've already seen it up front, and now we've seen it in the rear. So we check, are we already hidden? Well, if we have not hidden our mesh yet, we want to hide it. So we go and check, is the player passed through? Well, this is a special bool that I've set up. If we go into our viewport and we check out how I've configured these, you'll actually see two different things. You will see the mesh itself, you will see the collision mesh on the mesh itself, and then you will see another collision volume called exit volume. Exit volume itself is set to only overlap for a specific reason. We only want to know when the player walks through this, basically exit. And you'll notice I also have an arrow for direction purposes. So the intention here is player comes up and looks at this and nothing happens. We set it up, okay, now you want to disappear when you turn around. Player comes over here, turns around, the mesh disappears and the collision shuts off on the mesh. We turn back around. Well, we can't see this anymore, but there is still a volume behind it since we're pushing the person down a corridor. This collision volume is intended to let us know when the player has gone through our mesh and is far enough past the mesh that we can now hide this if we need to. It is our exit volume. So in our event graph, we check to see, have we actually passed through yet? If we have not passed through, then nothing happens. Where we set the pass through is in our overlap event. When the exit volume begins being overlapped, we use an implement interface check and check to see if it's implementing player. And the nice thing is the BPI player interface is literally nothing. I just use it for a cheap check on a collision to see if we're overlapping the player. Because if I was to fire a bullet through it or a monster was to go through it, I may not want it to react. So we check. Did the player exit? Did the player enter the exit volume? Have they begun overlapping it? If it is the player, then we say, okay, the player's passed through. And that's where we get the is player passed through. Then we do our next check. Do we show when the player is not facing us? Basically, if the player is not facing us, if the player is behind us in terms of we are past our mesh and the player is now behind us, do we want it to re-show this mesh? Do we want to make it visible again and block us? I made it a bool. I made it a triggerable option, and that's triggers yes or no right here. So if the player's gone through the exit volume and we're supposed to show this mesh if we're not facing it, if we've passed through it, it's hiding behind us right now, then we want to toggle our visibility on, basically make it so we can see our mesh again, set it where it's no longer hidden, clear out our triggers because we're done. There's nothing else we want to do. We've already gone ahead. One of our options on our respawnable down here is show on facing or show on not facing. It's show on not facing check. We've already gone ahead and told our blueprint, you know what? We've gone past this mesh. We've determined we no longer want to do anything with it. We want you to pop it up back on the screen and block us off basically. So we set our tags to none. We set our collision enabled on the exit volume. We disable the collision on the exit volume. That way we no longer are hit by line cat traces anymore. And then we set the material to the changed material. That's what allows us to basically turn a wall from green to red in our example. Now, if we have not already hidden this, then we hide our mesh. It's just as simple as that. So basically, your main branches are the player's not facing us. We've walked past. The player has walked past us. What should we do? Well, should we hide? Yes or no. Are we hidden? If we're not hidden, we should hide. If we are hidden, should we show ourselves? Has a player told us we should show ourselves? And that's what the code does. The event player facing us triggered is basically the same thing, but in the opposite direction. The player's facing us. Is this mesh hidden? Are we hidden? I keep slightly getting confused because I keep saying us when I mean the wall or the object, whatever blueprint we're in. So my mind's like completely confused on what it should be talking about. So just, excuse me for those. So we go in here. Are we the wall hidden? If we are not hidden, then we go ahead and we want to set our tag. Now we're back to this upper section I told you we come back to. Are we already hidden? Yes. Has the player passed through us? Yes. Are we supposed to show it when the player's facing? Yes. If we do, then we toggle our visibility, set our tags, because once it's visible, we're done. The whole point of this is to hide and re-show it based on certain conditions. So we go ahead and re-show it. We set our collision back to no collision so we don't trigger anymore, and then we set our material. I will go ahead and show these in example form, and we'll walk through to make it a little easier to understand, hopefully. And then down here we have our overlapping the collision volume. This is the main collision volume. Basically, you set this up around your mesh, and it's determined whether or not your player's safely in the mesh or outside of the mesh. So if, for example, the player was to walk through the wall, we're going to trigger our begin overlap of the collision volume. And what this sets our Boolean to are is player passed through to false. Our player has not passed through successfully. So once a player has gone through successfully, now we're waiting for them to exit. Once they've exited, now the player has passed through successfully. Well, the point here is you want to make sure that, let's say, for example, the player comes into here and then goes back and in and out, in and out, in and out. You need to make sure you're constantly tripping your bools so it knows exactly where your player's at. So let's just run through this and break point a few things and break a few things open so we can check them out. So let's say here's our first one right here. Let's say we have it set to show on facing. So we'll go ahead and run this, and we'll see what the difference is. So before, if we were facing the wall, well, actually, let's just do it. Show it how it works, and then show it the other way. So this is the green one we're working on. We're going to turn around, and we're going to walk backwards. If you notice, it does not show, it does not replace that wall while we're facing it. We don't want it to pop up in the middle of nowhere because it's kind of like, it's supposed to basically trap us in only when we can't see it, just like that. But if you enable this option and we run it again, and then we walk backwards through it this time, boom, it pops in. It's because of our event graph right here. If the player is facing the wall, and we've told it to show when they're facing, then there we go. And it follows through that one. And of course, you can do the opposite. We can set it to show on facing and not show on not facing. If we run it through this time, and we go through it, you'll notice the wall, if we get enough of an angle, it's not there. And then once we turn enough, boom, the wall shows up. So for example, let's flip these back. And let's take this hidden one right here, and we will set this one to show on facing. Let's see, show on facing. Yeah. Well, let's see what happens. I haven't played with these much, so let's see what happens. So let's go over this one. This one is hidden in here somewhere. There we go. So on this one, we walk through it, don't look back, and then it will snap, block us in right when we get there. Now, I mean, you could technically walk sideways. Yeah, let's see what happens. Let's walk sideways through it and see what happens. This only took me a few hours. This is meant just for you to learn, try to guide the player through a little story. I mainly, this is an example. So let's see what happens if we walk through it sideways. Yep, okay, see? So since we're not facing the actual trigger volume, it's not going to affect it. So feel free to modify the code. The code will be available. It's up on the GitHub repo. Feel free to do what you want with it. This is just, like I said, a quick example. Let's pretend we're a new player. Let's actually fix this one. And let's pretend we're a new player. And the whole point of this was to try to guide the user through an experience. It's not intended for puzzles. I'd like the ability for you to drive a story. You could have imagery in here that fades in and out. You can have music that changes based on certain cues. Everything that's the greatest part about blueprints. I have everything that's gray. 1, 2, 3. Those 3 things are all... Oh, and I forgot to actually cover the other thing. Those 3 things are all blueprints. This one is the destroyable one. These 2 are the replaceable ones. And simply by adding in more code to allow showing on facing or not facing, I could use the same blueprint and just check a few boxes and it'll work one way or it'll work a different way. Changes colors based on however you want it. It's the greatest thing. The other thing I didn't cover, which I'll go over, is the fact the text, like you said, the text is basically really simple. It is just generic volumes. I call it disappearing text, and the disappearing text is really simple. Basically, if we overlap, it shows the text, and if we are no longer overlapping, the text hides. And I have a simple bool in there that allows you to pass through it before it triggers, because, for example, there is another piece of text in here somewhere. Those ones, like the who is out there right there, for example. The who is out there is set to trigger if you were all the way over here, and then when you come back, it triggers. Assuming I went back far enough. Like I said, I didn't tweak. There we go. And now it showed up. And if you get close enough, it will disappear if you go to the wrong side of it. If you get out of its trigger range, which is, there we go. And now the problem with that one is I wanted it where it would trigger when the player came back, but not when the player went to the end. So I just, made it really simple, made a must pass through once variable. And all that does is, if you must pass through it once, and you've passed through it by using an overlap, then it just simply flips the bool to false, and now the next time it comes through, you're going ahead and you'll make it visible. So it's really simple. You can use that for whatever you want. One thing to keep in mind, as you may have noticed, we have a couple different pieces of text here. We have white text almost everywhere using our standard text renderer. But you'll notice in this room over here, at the end, it's black text. Well, by default, the standard materials, the standard default text material opaque uses light to determine what it looks like because it's an actual scene object. So all I did was take the default text material, change the shading model from default lit to unlit, and then dragged the vertex color into emissive, and now it's a emissive unlit material, and you can use that for your text. So that was a great little small thing I had to do in there. Let's see, I've got a couple unlit materials. These are just simple materials. Well, that's a material instance. So we have our master, and all it is just a simple material with an overdrive if I wanted to make it really glowy, and it emits color. It's simple. Our interfaces, our trigger not facing interface just has the player not facing us triggered, and the trigger plane facing has the player facing us triggered. We have our player, which again I said is just empty. I use it to cheat, determine if we're hitting the player itself. Blueprints, we have our disappearing text blueprint, which I went over. We have our removable wall blueprint, which I went over. Our replaceable wall blueprint, which I went over. And then I simply duplicated our first-person character and our first-person game mode. I had to duplicate the first-person game mode because I wanted to have a default pawn class of our new first-person character line casting for our demo. If you didn't do that, you didn't go up to blueprints, game mode, and change your game mode over, if we just had our normal first-person game mode, then you're not going to have line casts and, nothing's going to work. So that's how I did that. Now our first person character line casting I already covered. We just made one little change in here for our traces. One other thing I had to change was our first person projectile line casting. I've apparently changed something somewhere and broken something with our bullet. Did I change our material somehow? Nope. Oops. I don't know. I changed something. There should be bullets in here firing, which they're not, which they are. Oh, my bullets are no longer lit for some reason, which is extremely odd. Anyways, I've had to go into the projectile, went into the collision component itself, and changed it so that way it would not hit the actual collision volumes themselves, and it would pass through without an issue. So that way you didn't know that there was an actual collision volume there hiding. So, other than that, I think I've covered the basics. Feel free to use this for whatever you want. Question and comment. Throw things up on the document below in order to request anything else. I don't have a plan for next week. The Epic Jam might be participating in. I really don't know. But I'd love to see if someone uses this for a story-driven element and just to see what you can make of it. So you guys have a good rest of your day, night, weekend, and I will see you next week.